Welcome, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome to the Two Tokens podcast. My name is Alex Bausch. I'll be your host for today. And in today's podcast, we have Andy Martin from London and Jos Röling from Gouda. So to discuss the token economy. And maybe I can welcome you and have you introduce yourselves briefly, starting with Andy.
Hi, Alex, and thank you very much for having me on your show. And hi, Jos, great to see you again. So, Andy Martin from IBM. So, for my sins, I've spent 25 years consulting around technology. The last 5 or 6 years focusing just on blockchain. And I've been trying to answer kind of one question that's kind of been gnawing away at me for the last 5 or 6 years, which is how do you build business cases for this new collaborative economy, which is kind of been pushing me towards the idea of the token economy. So this is something I've been working on for the last few years, mainly from an academic perspective, but starting to have these conversations with clients now. So it's starting to become real.
Right, so and that's why we were puzzled. You know, we saw somebody write about the token economy and that 2 tokens were actually doing it. And actually, that's why we invited Jos to this call, being the captain of the Energy Token Working Group. Jos, maybe a brief introduction for the people who don't know you.
Okay, Jos Röling, also IBM. I'm the captain of the 2 tokens project for energy tokens. My ambition is to accelerate the energy transition by these new mechanisms and new ways of collaborating, especially in the deregulated world that we find in North America and in Europe. And we found some interesting use cases, and we're building it out and proving the tech that's available. So that's a very interesting dynamic to be part of.
Right. And we've been, Jos and I have been working, Andy, on the energy tokenization working group for almost 2 years now. We officially started May 21 last year, and we'll deliver the first white paper and the first MVP, in a couple of months. But for those of you who are new to 2 tokens, our key objective is to advocate the use of tokens and a token economy, and preferably not in an academic way, but by showing the economic benefits in real life projects. And those tokenization projects have been, among others, in the port, between the port of Rotterdam and Singapore, using electronic bills of lading in energy tokenization, but also tokenization of securities. And what we're trying to do is put this on the agenda for policymakers. And this podcast was recorded the second week of March. And earlier this week, we had this executive bill from the White House. What is your view on that, Andy? Is that going to help our efforts in advocating the token economy?
Well, I'm going to answer that question slightly differently, because I think regulation. So I come from the enterprise world, and we have to work in an environment where we are compliant and we comply with the regulations. And I think one of the big things that's really needed for this token economy is a new landscape of regulation. And when I kind of look back and ask ourselves, well, why have we got a lot of this regulation? KYC, AML, all this healthcare regulation. A lot of it is to do with problems that we've kind of inherited from Web 2. This idea of all these abuses of data, the fact that the individual doesn't control their data. So we have all of this regulation, right? And as we move into a Web 3 environment, I think we change that whole regulatory landscape, because when the individual is now in charge of their data, be this in the healthcare data where the patient maybe controls access to that data, or maybe be it financial transactions where you have personal identifiable information next to that transaction. The whole need for KYC, this financial surveillance, the whole need for protecting the patient from people abusing that data starts to change. So I think there's a real need to change the regulatory environment, and it's great to see that America is kind of leading that way. I remember in Wyoming, I think they were one of the first to to approve DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, and start regulating around that. So I think the whole regulatory landscape is really, really key. I'm not 100% familiar with what Biden has just done, other than I guess we're starting to think about, cryptocurrencies being serious players now in the financial landscape. And you can see this, if you look at what's happening in Ukraine, for example, you start thinking and say, oh gosh, is Bitcoin going to start becoming a reserve currency now? So we're going to have a regulatory environment to cope with this. So haven't answered your question directly because I haven't poured through exactly what Biden has done, but I do think we have to see this change in regulation to really enable the token economy.
You can find it on LinkedIn and on the internet, but the couple of executive orders, the first three are really more of the same. Protect the consumer. Do a lot about KYC. Make sure that the interest of the government is all that we know. So then you tend to think, how is that going to help crypto assets and crypto and tokenization? But then the latter three executive orders are all about innovation, making sure that decentralized environments and DeFi are going to be, and that America is going to take the charge in that. So I think overall we should be happy that America is going to lead the way, because here in Europe with MiCA and we're also trying to align all these different laws. And that was the purpose of Two Tokens, right? To create a roadmap and help companies and organizations navigate the wilderness, the jungle of what is necessary to get anything done in terms of legal, regulatory, and what have you. And Jos is from the energy landscape, and even there, it's not just legal, regulatory in terms of finance and what have you. It's also legal, regulatory in the energy systems. So it's the whole landscape for Web 3.0 needs to be revisited.
That's exactly my point. We need a new regulatory environment. The environment we've inherited reflects the abuses of data in the internet to date. As we rebuild the internet in a Web 3, we need new regulation to reflect the new environment. And critical to that, of course, is the individual owning access and control to their data. And I think that just changes the whole regulatory environment, and regulators need to get their head around that, I think. And it potentially opens the gate to really change and reinvent industries. The one that I'm passionate about is healthcare, and there's so much valuable data that the patient could make available to the development of new drugs and new treatments in the pharmaceutical industry, that if only we could unlock that door to linking and making that data available, I think you could see just massive changes in industries like healthcare, and also every other industry in time. But it needs that change in regulation, I think, to make this possible.
Yeah, so Jos, you're from the energy sector, of course. Different sectors out there are more prone to early adoption of token technologies and token economy. In your view, where are we with the energy sector? Also looking at what's happening in the world, a lot of pressure, we need to change to renewables. How could tokenization and token economy help that transition?
Oh, so for me, it means that the current energy system is very complex. Yes, so in a lot of things that are very technical, that are very hard to understand if you're outside the sector. So I think that tokenization can shield a lot of the complexities that are needed to make it work, but create a more elegant way to participate. So, and that is in line with the European Commission's Green Deal ambition for more consumer participation. So we need to change it. And I think it's also a challenge that as the energy is a critical element of an economy, it's highly regulated, as Andy already explained. So the tokenization should be an addition or a graceful transition, and not a rip and replace kind of strategy, because the risks are too high for any regulatory environment, each country to just remove the current way of working. So that's an additional challenge, I think. There is no green a greenfield environment where you can try it out. So and that it's quite a lot of different dynamics that we need to bring together.
But I think what's really super interesting, you look at the tokenization of energy and you say, well, okay, what problem am I trying to fix? And I think, as Jos said, there's a whole lot of problems in the world as it is and the way that everything works today. But you kind of open the door to then say, well, actually, we could reinvent industries, we could reinvent markets. And if you think of tokenization of energy, if you can make that link back to, where has it come from? This is solar energy. If you can capture this in an NFT, so you've now got a really flexible instrument, you can then build a whole lot of secondary markets as you start creating derivatives of the back of that energy token. So you start trading in, carbon credits and emission control, and you maybe link up to other ESG projects, maybe have interoperability with plastic offset credits, for example, and suddenly you create a whole load of secondary markets and create a whole load of new liquidity. And I think it's that explosion into the reinvention that is where the token economy really starts to take us to places that we can't really imagine today.
And that's
and also to address some of the foundational issues that we see currently in the market, right? So the current mechanisms, players, market structures are from a central large entity generating energy flowing to smaller bandwidths to the consumers. And with consumerization of energy generation, decentral generation, there is more and more need to support that as well. And the grids are not laid out for it. The market systems are not laid out for it. The governance is not laid out for it. So, and indeed, the whole energy transition to renewable. So we have some voluntary certificate schemes for the generation. So that's ESG scope 2, right? So those are the emissions for the energy that you purchase for your organization. There are offsets. That's very known. That's the contribution for your own activities. We see now use cases popping up of inset, so the scope 3 kinds of emissions to compensate that. So, and that needs to be orchestrated, right? And to be visible and to be monetized in order to inspire the changes. And a lot of markets are not open for instance, activists, if they want to purchase that those certificates in order to drive up the price, in order to make use cases more appealing for investors to step in. So it's very interesting to see all the different dynamics.
And you said some really interesting things there, Jos. I love the fact you started with the foundation. My mind tends to zoom 5 steps ahead, right? But you've got to get the basics sorted. You've got to get the foundations there. You've got to digitize, the industry. Then you move into this optimization phase where we can make the world as it is, better and more efficient. And then we move into this reinvent phase where we suddenly start saying, holy smokes, what's the point about having a PDF of a newspaper on a website? Let's start using the web 1 in that case, web 3 in our case, to actually change the way that we do things. And that's where it's difficult to see where this is going to take us, but it is so interesting.
So
So on the foundational, as a last point, Alex, so on the foundational level, right? So as IBM Research, we coined the term crypto incas. So you see now from the traditional world, the smart meters. And if I'm skeptical, it's only a remote reading of the meters, right? So not a lot of smart elements added yet. So and indeed, so here is a crypto anchor from Sunified, one of the parties in a project. And it means that we need to leverage what's already there, invested by consumers. So electrical vehicles have a very phenomenal energy management system. Why you need to have then an additional smart meter built on top of it in order to make it compliant to the old rules? Leverage what's already there and see how we can build new ecosystems on top of it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So what I think is important that we do is that we, the three of us here and a lot of our listeners are professionals and they understand and they can keep up. But in order for us to get to adoption of tokenized, that's a generational thing, I believe. But it's our duty to educate, inform, and inspire the world and industries and society as a whole by showing them the end value, by showing them what we're trying to do. And in particular, in the energy token use case, the value we're showing is democratizing solar energy. And how does that work? Well, I have a 21-year-old daughter. She lives in a dorm. She'd like to have solar panels, but she can't. She doesn't have a roof. But if you can offer that, through a portal using fractional ownership with tokenized solar panels, that's a use case that we can sell and can show today. And what benefit does that make? Well, it gives democratized access and raises local support among citizens for getting better yields and passive income from solar energy. And I think for a lot of people out there, to grasp the concept of tokenization. If you talk about tokenization, they just congested decentralized systems, Web3 and blockchain, and now we start talking about tokenization. A lot of people are afraid to admit they're having trouble to follow. So how do we do that? I think just show them real use cases and real business cases and how it works. That, and of course.
So question. Yeah, so a question on that, Alex. So I remember very vividly a discussion that I had in the 90s, where we had over a beer. Yeah. So are your friends having an email address?
Yeah.
And if they don't have an email address, are they still your friends?
Yeah.
And it was inconceivable that everyone was primarily contacted with email addresses. And I think here the same with tokens.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there is quite some misunderstanding and education to be done on the potential use and value of tokens in order to get it appreciated in the market, right? So, and then crossing the chasm, yeah. So Jeffrey Moore with how to create market adoption is a mechanism I think we need to pay an eye on.
And I think we are all three from that area, from that time period, that vintage. And I dare say that today. We're still trying to explain how an email is sent, SMTP, POP3, IMAP, but in reality, my mother-in-law, my daughter, she doesn't care, right? She cares about that the email gets there, and that parallel can be drawn to tokenization. So it's early stages, but I think it's important that we show the value, and that brings me to your primer. Andy, can you say, maybe you can explain a little bit to our listeners what it is that you're working on? Because you said, I'm taking it from an academic point of view, but I think it's very important because that's how we got to talk, right?
Yeah. Well, yes. So when I first got involved in blockchain 5 or 6 years ago, I was just so excited about what I was learning that I started sharing it on social media, in particular on LinkedIn. And I started having I found out by accident, actually, that when you put a point of view out on social media like LinkedIn, you can get a whole load of responses back where people like what you've done or they don't like what you've done. But you start to get a conversation, right? And you learn an awful lot. So this token economy primate, this represents really the accumulated learning that I've gained through having a conversation with the LinkedIn community over the last 5 or 6 years. And if we start with just this first sheet, how would I define the token economy? Well, we're moving into a world where what really matters is your wallet and the tokens you have in your wallet. And these tokens will do 3 or 4 jobs for you as a user. Critically, and this is really so fundamental, you can use this to establish your identity on the internet. So rather than signing in with your Google ID or your Facebook ID and giving loads of useful data away to a Web2 platform, what Web3 does and what the token economy does is it gives the user rights as an individual, as a fully paid up member of the internet. So you control access to your data, which is sitting there on the back end on the blockchain. You'll also have tokens to reflect things that you own, which could be an NFT here in this example. So if I think about a healthcare example, let's say I'm a patient, I've got MS, I'm looking to go and have a consultation with my consultant. I truck up with my iPhone, I've got my wallet, open up my wallet, establish my identity. So the consultant knows exactly who I am, right? I can then maybe give access to my medical records. So they can see, the consultant can see the provenance of my diagnosis to date. I could maybe affect a financial transaction. If maybe I'm looking to transfer data from maybe the public healthcare system to the private healthcare system, I may have to make a payment, and I can do all of this through my wallet, through this new interface. Because what you're doing is you're putting the individual in control. So we're kind of moving from an old paradigm to the new paradigm. So in the old world, the Web 2 world, everything that you did as a user was controlled by a central database. It was controlled by somebody else. You had to dance to somebody else's tune, So as a patient going to see your consultant, you've got to try and dig out that bloody letter or find out or try to piece together all the bits and pieces of data which are stuck all over the place. Whereas in the new world, you are now governing your own data and how that data is used on this new internet. So there's a massive power shift from the power being held by a central database to the power now being held by the data owner, which in the case of healthcare is the patient, right? The right person. And we're moving from a situation where your identity is controlled by Facebook or by LinkedIn or some third party central database to you now govern your data, and your credentials are verified. And we're moving to an environment where we're really looking to change the reward structure. If you think about sort of like a Google or a Facebook or a LinkedIn, you kind of feel, well, actually, all the rewards are kind of stacked up for the platform. The platform makes a load of money. They monetize me. This doesn't feel awfully fair. Whereas as we move into a Web3 environment, it's much more collaborative, and we are designing reward systems where we're changing behavior so everybody wins. So the patient wins, the consultant wins, the pharmaceutical wins, the hospital wins, the clinician wins, everybody wins. Right?
So of course, what you're describing here as decentralized autonomous organizations, and which is the ultimate goal of how we are going to organize society. But I think we still have a long way to go. What is your view on that in terms of energy systems? Energy systems, they are, well, now maybe the smart grids are finally becoming smart. Is that it? And then machine learning mechanisms will organize automatic DAOs and tokens will flow over those. That would be a utopia, or is that nearby? What do you think? What is your view on that?
I guess that's a question for Jos in terms of energy. I can answer in terms of other industries. I don't know whether Jos wants to start.
Well, let me rephrase. Well, what would be the energy in your mind, that is closest to adoption for DAO and machine? Because, that is what we're looking for, right? We're all about adoption.
So if you look at what's happened in the past as the incumbent enterprises have come together and said, well, okay, how can we collaborate and start to create these win-win outcomes? They've done so using very traditional mechanisms. So you build a consortia, it could be for profit, it could be not for profit. You're probably building a new company, and you're effectively using the traditional method. So the analogy I would give is, imagine we have a website for the first time. It's the New York Times. If you can remember that famous video of Steve Jobs doing a demo of the internet, and he showed the New York Times, and it was just like a photograph, like a PDF of the front cover of the Times. You couldn't do anything with it, right? So the way that companies are currently collaborating is they're putting that PDF on a website. They're using these traditional for-profit, not for profit. And I think that actually, as we move towards the token economy, we need a new way for these companies to collaborate, and a new way for them to effectively scale this solution out from more than 5 or 6 folks sat around the table to cover entire markets or entire industries. So that's what I think a DAO does, a decentralized autonomous organization. Now, in terms of adoption for the enterprise, I think we're at the very, very, very beginnings, right? And I'm particularly interested in healthcare. That's what I've been working on most recently. And if you're a pharmaceutical, these drugs that you're designing, they have like 10, 20-year kind of life cycles before they become generic and then fall off the edge of the revenue line. So these companies are willing to think in 5, 10, 15-year buckets. So we're just starting to have those conversations around, well, okay, if the thing that I really, really need is the patient data, right? And if that patient data is controlled by the patient, I've got to have a new model for how I interact with that patient. And this has got to be done on an open environment. It can't be done on closed, locked down central databases or closed, locked down networks. It's got to be open. So you've got no choice. You have to build this on a DAO. So I think we're just literally starting the conversations. So it's going to be 5 or 10 years away before this is really starting to have real traction on the market. It's not going to happen like next year, I don't think.
What's interesting here is that healthcare, like energy, is in the fabric of society,
yes.
Right? And the fabric of society takes a generation to change unless we have a war or pandemic or some other major event, and then under pressure everything becomes liquid. But I agree with you there. But it's going to be interesting to see how the current powers that are going to handle this type of innovation, right? Because it on the one hand we have the governments, centralized banks, and we have the enterprises and the industry, and we have the people, and so the parallel I see with energy systems and healthcare is the 5 to 10 year buckets, yeah. Right? That's what Jos, you design these smart grids. How do you see this?
So to me, for the energy system, I think we are on at the start, so very, very early, to understand, to move away from the plan economy kind of approach of managing the grids to a more decentralized solution. So, and I think that it needs to, we see early signs for it in the UK, for instance. There is an energy company is designed fully around a customer. So, and they designed an energy offering that's as different from the traditional energy offerings, from a Tesla experience to a traditional vehicle experience if you drive it. So it's a customer at the heart and a customer participation, and they see customer behavior change. So that new company not only interacts with their customers more and more appealing, but as a result, the energy footprint of their customers is reduced. So, and that's a better way of solving some climate change, than saying, well, let's throw certificates in, because that's a governmental regulation, right? So to inspire change. But I think those companies that are working internally, like at Netflix, or with different squads and having software updates 10 times a day. So that's not the traditional utilities. So they run SCADA systems for the last 2 decades, without major changes. So I think we need to look at those different proof points that indicate that change is coming.
Yeah, and you said some really interesting things there, Jos. I think we have to start with what is the problem that we're trying to fix, and why does this problem need to be fixed in new ways, and why can't it be fixed in old ways? And now you're the expert in energy, but if I look at it as an outsider, I say, well, okay, we've got some huge problems in energy. You know, if we're going to move to everybody has an electric vehicle, for example, how the hell are we going to manage that with the traditional grid, right? You know, we've got to move towards a more decentralized grid where we're using the solar panels on your roof. We have like all of this decentralization of power generation. We need to have that peer-to-peer transaction where if I've got spare power in my battery, I can sell it to you. You know, we've got to move from that centralized model to a decentralized model, or we'll never fix the energy problem. If you think about healthcare, you know, if you're a patient and you go and you've got cancer or MS, you know, what is the experience that you get? Well, it's bloody awful, right? You know, you as the patient have to be the project manager to stick everything together, but you have no tools. All you've got are letters and phone calls and emails. The whole system is breaking down. I can give you any number of examples from my own experience in healthcare of where the patient experience is just damn awful, right? So we've got to fix that. Now, you can't put it on a central database. We can't put everybody's healthcare records on a central database. That isn't going to work. It's got to be decentralized. And then you then say, well, what is the other problem we're trying to fix? Not just the patient experience. The other problem we're trying to fix is, well, we need precision medicines, right? We need to be able to design medicines for individuals, not just for whole conditions. And we need to drive new pricing models, new incentive models, new pricing models, which are much more outcome-based. The only way we can do this is in a new decentralized model. So if you look at these core problems you're trying to fix in energy, these core problems as a society we're trying to fix in health, and you say, well, we're never going to fix these on a central database. It's just not going to bloody work, right? And the digital native, you know, the youngsters coming through will simply not accept the healthcare experience. They simply won't accept it. It's not digital. It's unacceptable. And you look at it in an industry like healthcare and you say, well, either the healthcare industry is going to fix itself or it's going to be done externally to the healthcare system. But it's going to digitize, and it's going to digitize in a decentralized manner, in my opinion.
Yeah. And I think you're right. So, and I think it requires creativity to reassess the assumptions, to reframe the context, and find the problems that we need to solve. Because if we try to solve the old problems, then we're not gonna be in a space that we want to find ourselves.
Exactly. The token economy really is about reinventing industries. Now, we all have to be pragmatic, and we have to recognize that if there's some easy projects we can do to optimize and take some cost out of the existing world, well, we're going to do it, right? And get some money in the bank, you know, because we need to fund these transformation programs. But the objective is not to make the world as it is a little bit better. The objective is to build a new world, right? And it's a new power equation, a new political equation, where effectively, you know, you have a far better experience and you control access to your data and how that data is used and monetized. It's a massive shift in power in markets, and it's a creation of a whole lot of new secondary markets.
So the question is, will this massive...
And the last question.
But well, the question I have, you know, this massive shift, Andy, will it be an evolutionary process or will it be a revolutionary process, right? You know, and you can't answer this, right? You know, the time will tell. But this is a major move, right? We're in transition, right? And Correct. What we need to do is, you know, make sure that we create that narrative, and in these different sectors, right? There's so much going on, and people are just losing track. How can we help them and be that guiding light, if you will? Well, because what we're doing here is we're creating, a more granularity in society, in economics, and it's really we're requiring high definition economics. Right? That's what we're doing, and different sectors will adopt this earlier than others.
Yeah, well, I'd like to pick up something that Jos said. You know, and you know, we are on the third version of the internet now. That Web 3. Yes. If you go back to 1994, it was really, really hard to explain what is a website. if you go back to 2004, it was really, really hard to explain what is a social media account. And right now, today, it's really, really hard to explain what is a token and what is the impact of token on and tokenization on your industry. And I think what we have to do is exactly what you are doing, is come up with these examples, these use cases, where people can understand. And here in our conversation today, we're talking about use cases in energy and use cases in health. If you look at energy, the problem is, how the hell are we going to support everybody having an electric car and plugging it in? Our existing grid is just not going to do that, right? We have got to have solar panels on people's houses, on roofs. We have to have solar stations set up elsewhere. We have to have peer-to-peer transactions of trading of energy from neighbor to neighbor. How the hell are you going to do that? You can't do it on one bloody great big central database. It's got to be done decentralized. Right? If you look at healthcare, how are we going to improve the healthcare experience? Where, for example, I had an MRI. It sat on the MRI machine for 3 months until I chased it up, because nobody knew that it got stuck in the system. That data had got stuck in a department. I had a second MRI where I couldn't do it at the main hospital because it was full of COVID. So I'll go to another one. You then go back to the first hospital. 6 months later, they've got no clue that the MRI has taken place. They've got no access to the data. They've got no way to have that useful appointment with you. You then move from the public healthcare to the private healthcare, because the public healthcare has put a whole year delay into your diagnosis. You then go to the private. You see a top as consultant, and he has no access to your data, so you have to bloody start again, right? So, and the only person who can stick all this together is the patient. The experience is truly appalling, right? We have to digitize that. And the beautiful thing about digitizing it is you not only give a far better experience to the patient, as they now have visibility and control of the process, but that data which is being used to understand how effective various therapies are is like gold dust for pharmaceutical companies. They really want that one-to-one relationship, and they can't get it today because in the regulatory environment today, the pharmaceutical is just looking at massive, great big aggregate data where all the PII has been washed out. So they can't get close to the patient. So they can't develop drugs, which are that precision drug. They can't price it in terms of the outcome-based pricing, and the patient has a crap experience. You're not going to fix that with a database.
So what we're moving towards as a society is to a more decentralized society. And I'm a big fan of Jeremy Rifkin. And if you read his books, he's been predicting that for the last 20, 25 years, right? And if there is something that's going to have to work decentralized, it's the energy systems. Rather than putting everything on a main grid, as Jos can attest, we're going to have small pockets of small grids. Actually, we're full circle again, right? That's how we started 100 years ago. Every city had their own energy company. And so in a way, we're going to have to do that again. But if you look at the advent of the internet, and I was there in '85 when I had my first email address, and we had TCP/IP. What we need for if we want innovation in different pockets of the world, we need standards and methods. And that's what is coming to bear now. Right? We're talking in global platforms, European platforms, on token taxonomies, on standards, legal regulatory. That's a massive undertaking, especially because we have all these different sectors. And that is something we're trying to do, but we start small, in small sprints, just show people the money, where the benefits are, and take it from there. But it's not a sprint; it's a marathon.
Exactly. And you said something really important there, which is these standards. Because if you think of the core problem that we're trying to fix, is we're trying to stop data getting stuck in silos. So data stuck in one hospital, not readable by another, one department, not to another, one actor on the value chain to another. So we have to have those standards of data and those standards of interoperability. And actually, the best way to create those standards is, as you say, by the industry coming together, quite possibly in a more traditional consortium, to agree those standards and to agree those standards at the level of a market. Because if we think about these decentralized autonomous organizations, they, picking up from a point that Vice Buterin said a few weeks ago, what's really important are these zones of sovereignty. So if you're going to be deploying your DAO, and it's the healthcare DAO, it's going to have to sit within a zone of sovereignty, a European market or a US market. And it's going to have to be aligned to those standards for interoperability so data doesn't get stuck. And it's going to have to be aligned to this new body of regulation. So, for example, the patient can be in charge and owning their data, and where we can think about the impact at the level of society. So how do we make this fair so that we're not giving an unfair advantage to those who can use the technology versus those who can't? How do we bring everybody with us, and how do we design an economic model so that we genuinely have that win-win-win outcome and everybody wants to collaborate because they're getting benefits through collaboration? So I think there's a whole load of philosophy and politics and economics that needs to be done to make these decentralized autonomous organizations work. And that's going to be done at a zone of sovereignty, I think. So you're bang on the money there when we talk about the standards. That's absolutely core to it.
And so
and I have a question. May I, Alex? So
yeah,
I have a question. Yeah. So Andy, so if you look at the new way of collaborating and also coordinating all the interactions, I got a lot of pushback from talking to clients, and they say, well, tell me the risks. So there are so we understand not all but most of the current risks, and if we change it, we don't know what type of risk we need to face. So risk averse is something that's in nature of the energy sector, being pushed on reliability because it's so important on our daily life that the electricity is always present. So how do you perceive risk in your view?
Well, I think you can look at risks from both aspects. You can also say, well, what risks will we reduce? So if you think about healthcare, what you really care about are data breaches and fines through misuse of data. That's one of the things that you're most paranoid about. Well, if we move into a blockchain and a Web3 environment, particularly with the regulatory environment that reflects this new world, that risk actually is dramatically diminished because I'm now a full member of the internet. I control my healthcare records. I control who has access to that data and how it's used. I think of the example of Steve Jobs when he was talking about the iPhone in the early days, saying he had sleepless nights, worrying about some 14-year-old girl sharing her location. And he said, look, ask her, and ask her again. And it's the same thing with using your healthcare data. So we'll have this autonomous agent, I think of it like a fairy godmother that will be handling how your patient data is used, and will be giving permission each time that data is used. So I think it's not just increasing risk, it's also potentially reducing risk as we move to a more decentralized model. And think about banking. Banks are paranoid about KYC and AML and getting fined. Well, what have we done? We have created a surveillance system, where banks are acting as some sort of secret police.
They're the gatekeepers.
Well, exactly. Now, in the new model, we've actually fixed the internet. So each of these financial transactions already has PII, personal information attached to that transaction, which may start with some government-issued identity that can be verified. So that identity is not controlled, but that identity is verified. So you have those that issue, hold, verify identity pattern, but you have that credential attached to these transactions. So suddenly, it's no longer the role of the bank to be doing that kind of KYC surveillance. In fact, it could even become unlawful because they shouldn't have the right to potentially do this and monitor your activity. So again, like the healthcare, you're potentially taking away a regulatory risk. Because these risks reflect the current world where we have central databases. And if we have central databases, that means one person is going to get kicked if they screw up, right? Whereas if you have a decentralized system where the owner of that data is taking on much more duties, it's not just right, it's not just a right, it's a right and a duty, so decentralization isn't for free. You have to take on more responsibility, right? But it does change that entire regulatory burden. So I think we need an entirely new regulatory environment to make this Web3 work. And I think it really does change that risk paradigm potentially quite dramatically. So I think it's not necessarily about more risk. It could well be about less risk, and who is taking on the risk and who is managing that risk.
So this, we're coming to the end of this podcast, but this is actually a nice bridge to this last question that you posed, Jos, to a roundtable session that we'll be organizing this spring in May. We did that in 2019, 2020. We had roundtables with 3 silos of professionals, right? We had legal regulatory people, we had finance people, and we had the industry. And we discussed dilemmas in regulations. For instance, one of the dilemmas was back in two years ago. Blockchain, Bitcoin, bad. Is that bad? A lot of people seem to think so at that time. And so this spring we'll have new sessions. We'll be looking back what happened in the last 2 years, but we'll also be discussing in roundtables of groups of 10. The why, the what, and how of dilemmas that we are faced with today. And actually, the risk question that was just posed, Adney, that might actually be a very good a dilemma that we could have in this session. And you're invited. I invite you to participate, and we'll get you over.
Thank you.
Well, I would like to thank you both for having the time to have the discussion. I think we haven't heard the last of you, Andy. I would propose that we use your primer as part of a masterclass series because the community that is with 2 Tokens in Europe and across the world have shown an extreme interest in what we're doing. And I think it's our duty of educating the world and the communities. And your primer is just a great example and a great tool next to the token roadmap that the foundation is bringing out. Thank you. Any last comments?
Well, just my pleasure. It's been a wonderful conversation today. We could have talked for 2 or 3 hours rather than 45 minutes. So thank you very much. A really enjoyable chat.
Thank you both.
Yeah, thank you, Alex, for bringing us together. And it's a nice journey, and we are only starting. So that's absolutely a nice outlook that we have.
I'll see you next time.
That was it for today's podcast. Thank you for listening in, and please subscribe so you don't miss out on our upcoming episodes. If you want to get in touch with us, you can find our contact details at www.2tokens.org.